Welcome to this video on how to refine your notes over time. If you're used to taking notes or highlights as you learn, you'll know that's a great strategy for thinking as you learn and picking out the best bits. However, it's only the first step in learning. What you really need to be able to do is go back to those notes eventually and refine them. That might include getting rid of some notes that seemed interesting at the time but turned out to be not so useful. It might also include refining the wording of some notes, making them a bit clearer, making them simpler, so they really highlight the key point, the reason why you took that note in the first place. Another really useful strategy is to connect one note with others, or connect one idea with other ideas that you've been learning. And so instead of just being this kind of dead resource where you record a note and then it's left there forever, they come to life and they help you bring your own knowledge to life as you refine them. So let's see how we can do that in Dendro. Here we are. We're in Dendro, and a few days ago I was reading this article. It says, "Everything you thought you knew about learning is wrong," and it was an interview with Professor Bjork. Now, I took some notes by highlighting sections like this and clicking Add Note, and you can see I've taken 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've taken a few notes from this article. Now, when I click Engage today, it's going to show me some of those notes. And when it shows me those notes, I'm going to have a chance to refine them. So let's see what that looks like. So this note comes from an article that I read the other day that we just saw. And it's got an idea that's important to me. But it also is a little bit dense. There's a lot going on. So with this type of note, what I want to do first is just highlight the important bit. And often that is done most easily by separating out different sentences. So the first bit says, "People tend to try and learn in blocks, mastering one thing before moving on to the next." But instead he recommends interleaving, a strategy in which you, for example, instead of spending a whole hour on a tennis serve, you mix in a range of skills, and that creates a sense of difficulty. So for me, I want to highlight this word interleaving and just make it bold. And this word mix in a range of skills, or even just mix in a range or mix. I'll go with just mix. Okay. So now I've highlighted the key ideas in this note, and not only does it make it easier to read right now, where I'm looking at this note, I think immediately this note is about mixing and interleaving things that I'm learning, but even more importantly, it's clarified the idea in my brain, so that when I walk away from the computer now, that idea has been kind of solidified and reinforced just by doing that little bit of text formatting. But by doing that, I had to think through the ideas, and so that's actually not only helped me understand it better, just slightly better, but it's also going to help me remember these ideas for longer, even without making any flashcards yet. Okay, so let's have a look at another example. Here we have another note from that article, and it's giving some different advice. It says, "Take notes just after class rather than during." Right? Get out of court stenographer mode. So there's a couple of things I want to do here. One thing again is I want to separate out these sentences which say slightly different things. Right? First, Bjork recommends taking notes just after class. Now, I'm no longer a student. I don't go to class. I learn things on my own at home or at work. So I'm going to change this, and I don't really care what the original author was writing, because now these are my notes and I'm writing them in the way that's useful for me. So I'm going to say Bjork recommends taking notes just after learning, right? And this word also isn't required now. And this bit here, you know, it's not that relevant right now. You have to work for it, right? But I like this sentence because it's quite a vivid image, right? You're in a courthouse and someone's you've got the stenographer who's trying to record every single word that's being said. But when you're learning something, instead of trying to do that, it can actually be useful to take notes just after learning rather than during. So I'm going to also highlight these words and make them bold. And so again, you can see we came to a note, it had some ideas there, and we broke them apart, we simplified the wording and emphasized what's the core of this. The core of this is don't try and record everything, right, like a court stenographer. Instead, once you've done some learning, take a step back, reflect, and write down some notes. And so again, just by doing that little bit of separation and putting some things in bold that I think are important, I've made this note not only easier to read for myself next time I see it, which is going to be in a couple of days, but I've also made those ideas stick in my head better because I've been thinking through them now. Okay, let's see another example. Now this note from that article, it's asking a few questions, saying these are the opposite things I should do, but it's not saying that much. I think actually this came from the introduction of the article, and maybe when I read it I thought, wow, that's interesting. And so I highlighted it, I clicked add note, and now it's in its own note. But now a couple of days later when I'm looking at it, I'm thinking it's not actually that useful after all. So in these cases, and this actually happens fairly often, where you might see something, you hear something, you read something, you think, wow, that's interesting, but when you come back to it, you think, actually, it's not that interesting, especially not out of context. So I'm going to remove this from the feed, right? And it says this note will not be reviewed again. Great. So this is actually a really important part of processing your notes, is removing the things that are no longer valuable. Let's go next. Okay, this is another note about interleaving. Now, because I went through the effort on that other note to highlight that word interleaving and make it bold, it really actually stuck in my head. I remember that it's about mixing different skills and mixing things while I'm learning them. And so now I'm reading this note, which on the face of it seems like it's completely isolated, but actually in my head now, the ideas are connected. So let's see what this one's saying. Again, separating out the sentences. Right, so it says if information is studied so that it can be interpreted in relation to other things, right? That's the key idea. It's saying learning is more powerful when we mix things, because we start learning each idea and sort of connecting and comparing it with other ideas. And now because I just learned that idea of interleaving, I can actually put in brackets up here, mixing, right? I learned that interleaving is mixing, and by adding that word in there, that clarification, I'm linking the idea in this note to the other one, and most importantly, I'm doing that in my head, right? Now we could link this with hyperlinks, we could link it by adding an actual link to the other note, but that wouldn't necessarily do anything for our brain. But by putting a word or an idea or an example in here, so in another case I might put an example, so like e.g. reading notes on different topics in Dendro, right? So in Dendro, as we've seen, each time I click next, it interleaves these different ideas. When I click next, I might see something on a completely different topic. So that's an example that I'm familiar with, and by putting that example in here, next time I come back to this note and I see this idea of interleaving and why it's useful and how it works, I also have a good example of that. So now this note is refined and more valuable than it was when I got to it originally. So now we've seen what that looks like learning with Dendro and refining our notes. And this is probably a process that you will never have done before, because Dendro gives you an opportunity to come back to those notes that you've written before and have a second go at making them even better. So if this is a process that you feel is missing from your workflow, if you feel like after you read and learn things, you take some notes, but you don't really process those ideas afterwards, well then you can actually just sign up today for your Dendro trial account and try that process for yourself.